a good tool to have in terms of getting to know us is our app. You can download for free at any one of the app stores. Just search for Union Chapel and you'll find it. Lots of good stuff on there. Our bulletin is on there, our sermon notes. You can download and listen to past sermons, see upcoming events. What I want to draw your attention to, though, is that we have a Connect card there, which you can fill out and let us know that you're here, give us your information, or if you're a regular attender and you want to update your information or give us your information if you've never given it to us, you can do it through that Connect card. And we would be more than happy to reach out and say hello. If you'd rather not introduce yourself via email, but in person, coming up 2 Sundays from now, we'll have a newcomers forum on Sunday, March 4th, up in the annex after each service. About 15 minutes. We'll spend some time talking about the mission and vision of Union Chapel, introduce you to some of our staff, give you an opportunity to ask some questions and meet some other new folks. So I want to invite you to that. If you're new or newish or newisher, we invite you to that. Couple of things. I know I mentioned this last week, but we have some great resources for the season of Lent. We kicked off our season of Lent on Wednesday with our Ash Wednesday service. But on our app, there's a little Lent tab that you can click on. It's got some helpful information, an article on fasting and Lent, an article on how to use the resources that are on the app. The main things I want to draw your attention to are our lectionary readings. Every Monday, we'll launch a new week of reading the same 4 passages all week long together. And so you'll see those passages there just under lectionary readings. There's an Old Testament, a Psalm, an epistle, and reading from the Gospels. And then if you're a bit of an auditory learner as well, we've got a meditation file on there. It's an audio file. It's about 12 minutes long. You can listen to all of those scriptures kind of back to back being read. And we want to encourage you to use that when you're working out or when you're driving or maybe when you're laying on your bed at night or with your family at dinner time or after dinner time. So there's lots of ways you can use that, but I encourage you to use that. And then lastly, on Fridays, we're posting an art contemplation that matches with the gospel reading from that week. And so if you were paying attention, this week we had an art contemplation around Jesus in the wilderness. It's just another way to engage with the scripture through art and through our eyes and through what we see. And so this is a great way that we can all be engaged throughout the season together as we walk through the season of Lent. Sometimes it can feel like a really solitary journey, and we want to give you the sense that we're in this together through the coming months. Then you'll find that on Sunday, kind of as the culmination of our worship, our service will be built around those same lectionary passages. And so even this morning, if you've been in those passages, you would be hearing things in our liturgy and in our songs that are connected to that. And so look for it tomorrow morning. There'll be a new reading and meditation, and look for on Friday for one of those art contemplations. Quick reminder, we during the season of Lent, during the season of Lent, we have a prayer, an opportunity to join people in prayer during the 9 o'clock service. So you're obviously attending the 11. So if you want to come to the 9 o'clock and meet up in the office, there's a group of people that are feeling called to pray through this season, pray for our services and for our church. Want to invite you to that at 9 o'clock. Also coming up, I know you've heard a lot about this in the last few weeks, but Wholehearted, our women's connection, is happening 2 weekends away, March 3rd at 9:30. Want to invite all of you women to come and engage around shared stories and life together as you will be talking about what it looks like to live wholeheartedly in a world that just encourages fragmentation. So would love for you to join the women for that. Then last but not least, we have a guest speaker coming in March. On March 11th, Ken Weitzmo will be with us. Ken is the founding pastor of Antioch Church in Bend, is transitioning actually this month to take over the lead pastor role at Village Baptist in Beaverton after more than a decade at Antioch. Ken's also the president of Kilns College and the founder of the Justice Conference, and an author of about 3 books. So makes me feel like I haven't done anything with my life. But Ken is a friend that goes back to childhood for me. Is a wise person, and really excited for him to come and talk about his last book, or at least around the topic of his last book, which is called The Myth of Equality, which really deals with the issues of race in our country. And Ken's going to be unpacking what we need to know to be grounded in conversations about today's race-related issues as we seek to move into a deeper understanding of both the origins of these issues and the reconciling role we're called to play as ministers of the gospel, which is a really important thing for us to consider. So I want to invite you to that on Sunday, March 11th. Then, the day before, on Saturday, not March 11th, because I just said Sunday, March 11th, so that's a typo. My apologies. Saturday, March 10th, we're going to have a Q&A dinner with Ken where he's just expressed a desire to come and be a part of our community for the whole weekend. And so on that Saturday, he's going to come. We'll have a dinner up in the annex, an opportunity to engage around this conversation and issue. We'll have a light dinner and just an informal time to talk to Ken. The only requirement, and it is a decent requirement, is that you have read the book. And that's not a ploy to try and get you to buy Ken's book. It's more, this is a complicated issue, and one that we can bring a lot of assumptions into. And so I think what would be really helpful for us is if we've read his content, then at least we can engage around that content in a meaningful way. And so you can go ahead and pick up that book, order it on Amazon today, get started on it. We'll have a couple copies here next week that you can pick up as well, but if you want to get a jump start, it's called The Myth of Equality by Ken Weitzma. So that's exciting stuff coming up in the month ahead. Looking forward to that. That's all I have for announcements. I'd like to go ahead and pray for our offering. Would you join me in praying this? Blessed are you, God of all creation. Through your goodness, we have these gifts to share. With them, we offer ourselves to your service and dedicate our lives to the care and redemption of all that you have made. For the sake of him who gave himself for us, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. We have a treat this morning. Maybe you know or remember from last few weeks of announcing this, but Heather Thomas is with us this morning. I've known Heather for probably about 15 years. I had the pleasure of working with Heather when we were on staff together at Imago Dei Community for a few years. Well, I was kind of pulling some double duty, doing some like church planting / working with Imago. And there's a lot that I could say about Heather besides her British accent and how just like a tractor beam sucks you in every time. But I think getting to observe Heather's ministry over the years, she has just a true shepherd's heart for people. There's a lot of things as a pastor you can get caught up in as it relates to church. And Heather's always been somebody that I see has been grounded in the reality of shepherding and caring for the local church. And her passion for that comes out in her teaching. It comes out in the way that she cares for those that God has entrusted to her, and which makes it really crazy that a couple of years ago, after spending 14 years in Portland, God was kind of calling her to a sister church of ours, an Imago Dei, Missio Dei in Salt Lake City, and she's been down there for the last few years as the community pastor there. So we are in the season of Lent and have asked Heather to come and teach us from these passages that we've been in, and you're going to really enjoy this, I think. So would you join me in welcoming Heather Thomas?
Thanks, Adam. Yeah. Appreciate it. Good morning. Glad to be with you this morning. As Adam said, my accent gives me away. I'm not originally from the US. I'm originally from the UK. North part of the country, near Manchester. Any Manchester United supporters in the room? No? And I grew up in the Lake District, Beatrix Potterland, and a beautiful part of the country where I was formed deeply. My spiritual formation kind of started there and got really rooted in my faith in that part of the world. Then moved to Portland, spent 14 years in Portland. And the Pacific Northwest is also a place that I feel rooted, that has had a significant impact on my own spiritual formation. Brad Harper was here this morning, and I was like, oh yeah, he's one of my professors. So like, if you don't like what I say, you can talk to him. So this place has been integral in who I am as a person, and good friends, as Adam said, with he and Jake over the years, and grateful to come back and be with you this morning. I know that you are in the middle of Lent, and I join you in this season. We too had an Ash Wednesday service over in Salt Lake City, a place that I've now lived for 4 years. And so I'm excited and grateful to be able to join you as you enter into this season. I know that you've also been very intentional, and so as I was listening to the lectionary readings and the meditations, it's a gift to be able to have those resources during the week. And then I know coming up in March, you have a Solitude and Silence Day. You've participated, or maybe some of you are beginning to participate in fasting. And all of these intentions that set yourself up as you make your journey to that morning of Easter, where we celebrate in a different capacity, not just the work that Jesus does while he lives, but then subsequently in his death and his resurrection. And I loved last week, I listened to Adam's introduction, because it's always nice to get a feel for where people are at. So I listened to his speaking last week, his sermon, really encouraged by it. And I loved what he said about what these practices are not. These are not moments where you have a hunger strike, where we're trying to demand something from the higher ups. And it's also not about religious piety, proving to God that we are deserving, or that we earn his favor, or that we kind of want to do these actions in order to strong arm him into giving what it is that we want or ask or think we need from him. No, the intention of these practices is to pay attention. What do these practices bring up? What do they elicit out of our minds and our hearts and our lives? The art that is on the wall out there, that's what Scott Erickson says, like, what is this practice drawing out of me? And I think maybe that solitude and silence is the one that potentially terrifies us the most. We live in a world that is ripe with distraction. So many things that keep us distracted, whether it's the phone that's in your pocket, or the busyness that life demands, the work, the care, all the things that are asked of you in a day. Or maybe even fear. Kind of a little terrified of what might come out with if I sit there for even just a couple of moments of silence. What would emerge? It's like a small feeling of terror. I do respite care for foster kids. It's one of my favorite things that I get to do in the world. And I hang out with these 2 teenagers, Somalian teenagers. Parents are both dead, and so they were resettled to the US. And so I'm good friends with their foster parents. And so decided that I would go through and be trained in order to do respite. And then these 2 girls, they just come and stay with me. And it's like rocking out in the car, time with teenagers. And I also have these 2 other little kids, a 7-month-old and a 2-year-old, because their mama definitely needs a minute. And so I spend time with them too. But the older teenager, she has a coping skill, and it's music. She listens to music all the time, because the silence is hard for her, and for good reason. And sometimes the silence is hard for us for good reason. Because we're paying attention not only to God, but we're also paying attention to our inner selves. The things that are in our hearts. And we don't always want to know what is in there, or to peer back, to be reminded of what is in there. When Jesus was asked in the 22nd book of Matthew what the greatest commandment was, he said this: "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself, as the law and prophets hang on these two commandments." And I know that you talked about the second commandment not too long ago, this golden vision that is articulated in the Beatitudes. And the first part that Jesus speaks, or the first commandment, is a direct quote from the book of Deuteronomy in what is known as the Shema. And it is a Jewish practice. A practice, they read this portion of Deuteronomy in the morning and the evening as a prayer. Still done to this day. It started thousands of years ago, and they continue to read this as a discipline and a practice for them as a people. Deuteronomy 6, 4 and 5. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your might." And they read it twice a day as a prayer. And it starts out with the word hear. Hear, O Israel. And that word is not only specific to actually having information go into your brain and acknowledge it. The sense of hear is that you would act upon what you've heard, therefore demonstrating that you have indeed heard it. So every parent in the room, put your shoes on. To the kids, put your shoes on. Put your shoes on. Please put your shoes on. Can you put your shoes on now? How do you know that they've heard you? I put their shoes on, right? They are demonstrating, proving to you that they've heard you. Say to them, "My sweet, dear child, please put on your shoes. We need to get out the door." That's the emphasis here, that these people would hear, not only hear in terms of have information, but they would act upon the information that they know, thus proving that they've heard from God. And then God is named very particularly here as Lord. And that name that is given to him, the translation is Lord, but the Hebrew would be Yahweh, something in a word that you're probably mostly familiar with. And Yahweh was the personal name for God. It was the name that he had given them to call him. He's knowable, that he's committed, and that he is their faithful God. Hear, Israel. Yahweh, this God that you know, is one. Be committed to him. In the midst of a world where there is this plurality of gods, the sense is that he is committed to them, and they in turn would be devoted and committed to him, to love him. And for the people of Yahweh, love is their politic. Meaning that love is behind all of their activities and actions. Love and their connectedness to Yahweh is what drives what they do. So it's a prayer, but it is also a declaration, a commitment that their lives would be ordered and managed around love. Love of Yahweh. And we would usually say that we love with our heart, right? That's generally what we talk about when we're talking about love. And in the Shema, it is also mentioned here, the soul and the mind, but I want to focus in on the heart today. Because the heart is all the way throughout the scriptural text, but it's also all the way throughout our cultural text. Loving with our heart. We just had February 14th. Not only Ash Wednesday, but Valentine's Day. The Day of Hearts. I arrived, I'm staying with my cousin. He lives down in Portland, and I'm staying with him, and he has a 5-year-old. And as soon as I walk in the door, he's all, "Hello, come over here. So I walk over and he has this like big bundle of Valentines that he got at school. This little envelope, and everybody got to put their little Valentines in there, you know? So he's showing me meticulously, one by one, and reading the names to me and telling me like who these people are. And they're so cute. There's this one and it's just this little piece of paper and it has a name on it, and he's like, this one's just a bit of paper. I was like, that's right, Adric, it is. Probably given with a great deal of love. But he's already sorting through his preferences. This is Chloe. You know? He has affection for his little buddies that he plays with at school. He understands that there are things and affections that he feels in his heart. Tim Mackey, who does a great outline in the Bible Project, if you ever wish to look it up, on the heart and the biblical understanding of the heart. Our notion is that we have a heart and it's an organ and it pumps blood around our bodies, and therefore we have oxygen and all sorts of other things that I would be able to tell you more explicitly if I were a doctor. But I do know that it sustains the life that I have, and therefore I'm standing up in front of you because my heart is working. It is also an emotive part of us, the heart. We follow with our heart. Listen to your heart, right? Was that like an 80s song? But it's like they elicit something, these songs and these affections. And that's not untrue in the biblical text, that it tends to point us towards feelings and expressing those feelings. It's true in ancient Israel that they believed that there was an organ at the center of the chest that kept and sustained life. They also used throughout the biblical text the language of emotions and attach it to the heart. So you feel despair, you feel despondence. The Hebrew phrase broken heart is actually where we get the phrase broken heart from. But the biblical authors also talk about the heart in ways that may seem strange to us. They did not have an understanding of the brain. And so the place of intellect was also from the heart. All of the intellectual activity took place in the heart. You would know with your heart, you make connections with your heart, wisdom comes from the heart, you discern between good and bad or truth and error in the heart. It's where you make your choices. So while being understood as something that is emotive and affective, it was much more robust, much broader in terms of their understanding of what the heart drove and what it meant and how it applied. So while loving Yahweh with your whole heart had an emotional component to it, it was much broader. It was related to every aspect of the life, and so your actions flow from connectedness and relatedness to Yahweh, which would include your job and your words and your money and your relationships, like you name it, flowed from this relatedness to Yahweh. My grandmother, when she was 11, my grandmother is an Irish woman who is now 96, and she tells the story about at 11 when her father died of a heart attack. And as a 96-year-old woman, she still talks about this moment in her history. She tells me stories of remembering things that she did with her father prior to his death. And she talks about the subsequent grief that came from not having his presence in her life anymore. And what that meant for them as a family, a large family who no longer had a person that was the breadwinner, moving out of their home into a smaller home. It was a significant moment for her, one that she continues to talk about in a way that is honoring of her father. 5 years ago, my own father was sitting in his office. He was doing work, and he is a relatively fit man. I would say he's fit. He probably would give me a frown if he heard me use the word relatively fit. He is fit. He's 70, so it was about 5 years ago, and he's sitting at his desk, and his heart started to race and go crazy. So So he's like, whew, it's usually the feeling when you get after a good jog up the hill, but feeling a little unnerved about the rapid heart rate that I'm feeling in my chest. So he sat there for a few minutes and it just continued, and so he got up and he went round the corner, and there's a woman that works around the corner who at one point was a nurse, and so he just went in and checked with her and said, hey, something seems to be amiss with my heart, can you check it for me? And sure enough, he had a racing pulse, and so she's like, yeah, we need to get you to the ER. And so they went to the ER and they did a number of tests, and sure enough, he has a heart condition, which now he has to be very mindful of after doing all of these tests. And so when I go into the doctors and I fill out my forms, they always want your familial history. And so I'm like, grandfather passed away of a heart attack, dad has a heart condition. And so they're like, oh, right. Good to know, good to know. So then when they take my blood and they see that I have high cholesterol, they're all, oh, probably need to try and work on that or make sure that we have these levels, or we'll just be touching base with you about what is going on with you. Because there's a history that I have. There's a genealogy that goes before me that tells them something about potentially the condition of my own heart. And so I'm mindful. And these lectionary readings that you had this morning tie us to a genealogy. A genealogy that tells us a story about our heart. A diagnosis of the condition of our heart. For those of you who listened, the readings began in Genesis. We know that in Genesis chapter 1, God created humans in love as image bearers, created to love and reflect his image back into the world. And as humanity, cultivating and creating out of relatedness to God, relatedness to each other, and relatedness to the rest of creation, that's who we are and what we were here to do. There's a sense of both identity and a sense of vocation that comes out of that moment in Genesis, chapters 1 and 2. And then in chapter 3, through an act of trust at the allure of the serpent being this anti-God entity that is woven all throughout the biblical text, and his invitation is to a mistrust of God. And so they do, in a willful act of rebellion, they take that fruit and they consume it, and in that moment the heart is bent away from this trusting relatedness to God. It's a moment where relationship is fractured. Image is marred. And so that sense of vocation and purpose with it. We turn in on ourselves as a humanity, and who we are and what we were made to do is forgotten, is changed inside of us. Humanity didn't remain faithful to who they were and what they were intended to do. But God does not forget or set aside or overlook. He's not done with us, and we know that throughout the biblical text. He calls a man called Abraham. And he says to Abraham, I'm going to bless you and through your people to everybody everywhere. So he gives them an identity and a sense of purpose. To be related to him, to reflect him, Yahweh, to the rest of the world. And we know Abraham's people turn into a larger group of people, Israel. And Israel is inextricably woven together and connected to Yahweh. And Hosea and Jeremiah and other places, this nation is called his son, his beloved son, his child. And it is to these people who those words are given for the first time from Deuteronomy. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, Yahweh, is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your strength and with all of your might, your soul and all of your might. And they're to be devoted and committed and faithful. Why? Because they want to have, or they're going to have this redemptive, reflective presence of who he is in the world. They have a job to do. And the Shema roots them in who they are and what they're called to do. But they're not devoted. And they're not committed. And they don't remain faithful. One of the most vivid pictures of this comes to us through the prophet Jeremiah. He spends a lot of time with these people. And as you read his book in Jeremiah, you see that they break relatedness with Yahweh and they have allegiance and devotion and affection to other gods, the gods of the nations around them. To the point where they will take their children to sacrifice on behalf of these other gods, to please them and to appease them and to plead with them, to give them what they want. They also forget their vocation and they take advantage of widows and orphans and immigrants. And the leaders that are watching this don't seem to mind, because they're growing in what they would perceive as their own success and power and control at the cost of others. And as Jeremiah watches this for 20 years, his heart is broken. And he says, after watching them in Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9, he says this about the condition of the human heart. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately sick. Or irreversibly sick would be another way to say it. Who can understand it? As he watches these people that were supposed to be committed and devoted do these horrific acts to their own children and the communities around them. The NIV says a human heart is more dishonest than anything else. It can't be healed. Who can understand it? Their actions display the condition of their heart, and it is ruptured. Their hearts are ruptured and unwell. Tim Mackey, the scholar and originator of the Bible Project, says this: even when God shows extra measures of grace, we are so bent that we still find new ways to mistrust God's word, to doubt his goodness, to think he is holding out on us, and to act in really destructive and disrespectful ways. And this is not only true of Adam and Eve and Israel, it's true of us. It's true of our lives. It's true of what we do and what we say. Facilitate groups at Missio. We create space so that people can begin to understand where their behaviors are coming from. Because many people do things that they'd rather not do, but find it difficult to not do those things. And so we have these groups as a community that create space to explore what that is and what drives those behaviors. And one of the processes is to identify that the heart is broken by things that we have done and by things that have been done to us. Our hearts are broken. And our response most often to that brokenness is that we isolate. And we prefer being alone. Because trusting and connecting feels too hard. Trusting and connecting with God or trusting and connecting with others, it just feels too hard. And so we find new ways to mistrust God's word, to doubt his goodness. We think that he is holding out on us. And we act in disrespectful and destructive ways, both to God and to each other. So we are self-protective out of fear. And we're defensive We're irritable, even aggressive and angry. We hoard our things. We hoard our emotions. We're conceited and proud and blaming. And it's mostly at the expense of others. And often, it's at the expense of those we love the most. Those that are closest to us. You may have had an interaction like that even today on your way to church. And we do those things as individuals, and then as individuals we make up communities, and we do those things as communities, and then as communities we make up nations, and then we do those things as nations. And I am acutely aware that there are an enormous amount of things that have been done from the nation that I am from and as an empire at the expense of others. You just have to walk around the British Museum. And all of this in the biblical text and then in our lived reality kind of lays out before us that we need help. That we are in need of help. That we have hearts that are sick and lives that demonstrate that sickness. And how we relate to one another, how we build our communities, and then how we act as nations. And thankfully, a couple of chapters later in Jeremiah 33, he gives indication that there is hope. Hope for these hearts that nobody can understand. And he declares that God will bring hope. There is a promise of God intervening with hope. That he is going to do something new, that he is going to write his words on our hearts so that we can truly know him. And that he will forgive, that there is grace and mercy that has the capacity to cleanse and cover both individual and systemic brokenness and injustice and poisonedness. And it's that cry of relief from the lectionary reading from Psalm 32 that was read this morning. Blessed is the one whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the one against whom the Lord counts no iniquity, and in whose spirit is no deceit. It's the cry of hope, not only from Jeremiah, but also from the psalmist, David. And so the question is, how does this help come? So we turn to Matthew chapter 4. We'll begin reading at verse 1, the gospel reading for today. The temptation of Jesus. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. And the tempter came and said to him, If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread. But he answered, It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Then the devil took him to the holy city and set him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, He will command His angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. Jesus said to him, Again, it is written, You shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Again, the devil took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, All these I will give to you, if you will fall down and worship me. Then Jesus said to him, Begone, Satan, for it is written, You shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. Then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and were ministering to him. In verse 1, you can see that the Spirit of God leads Jesus not into temptation, but into the wilderness to be tempted. The Spirit of God knows where the Son must travel. And he's tempted in that wilderness place, the place of hostility and solitude, by the devil. That entity that first showed up in Genesis. The entity that exists to work against the purposes of God. And the main way that that entity works is by sowing seeds of mistrust. Seeds of mistrust so that relatedness is broken. The same way that that relatedness was broken in Adam and Eve as they bent their heart away. That's the temptation that is coming to Jesus here. Break that relatedness, that connection that you share with Yahweh through mistrust. And he's been there, verse 2, for 40 days in the wilderness, and he's hungry. And so the tempter comes in a moment of vulnerability. And just prior in chapter 3, Jesus has gone and he was baptized in the Jordan, and as he comes out of the water, the voice that is heard is the words of God speaking over him. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. We know who he is. He knows who he is. The beloved Son. And so enter the tempter, coming to break that relatedness, to entice him towards mistrust. And rather than focus on the temptations, I want to focus on what Jesus says in response to the tempter. Firstly, it's important to note that everything that he says comes from a particular moment in Israel's history. He quotes from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6 through 8. And this is the moment where they've just spent 40 years wandering around in the wilderness, and Moses is speaking over them, reminding them of what this hostile place, the wilderness, was intended to teach them. It was intended that they would learn trusting dependence on God and Yahweh. But we know that they didn't. They did not learn that, as Jeremiah subsequently paints for us. They abandoned that allegiance and devotion and faithfulness. And so, as the tempter comes, all of our eyes are on Jesus. And he first tempts him with hunger. After these 40 days, his body is weak and he's hungry. And so the tempter tempts him. And he quotes from Deuteronomy chapter 8 and verse 2. And in that moment, it is a reminder from Moses that God provides. But Israel forgot that God was the one who provided. Jesus will not. Jesus will not forget that. The second time the tempter comes, will God really follow through for you? Will he really follow through for you? Jesus quotes from Deuteronomy 6 and verse 16. Israel tested God rather than trusting him. Jesus will not. And the third temptation is the temptation to abandon loyalty. Abandon loyalty to Yahweh. And again, Jesus quotes from the book of Deuteronomy, verse 6 and 13, where there's a command to worship God and Him only. Israel were unfaithful in their worship, and they abandoned what they came to do. Jesus will not be unfaithful. He will not take shortcuts to accomplish the work that He has come to do, not at the cost of relatedness and loyalty to His Father. Jesus will not break that relatedness to Yahweh. And let's remember where the beginning of what's at the beginning of this section. It's Deuteronomy 6, we just read it. The Shema. This is the section out of which Jesus pulls His words. Deuteronomy 6, 4 and 5. Hear, O Israel, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart. Yahweh, love Him with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might. Jesus hears, and He acts on what He hears. And every single step of the way, He remains faithful. And His love for Yahweh takes Him to the greatest demonstration of love, to the cross. And the climax of His redemptive reason for coming to be with humanity. Jesus bends in that moment on the cross. He bends the capacity of the human heart back to trusting dependence on God. And in this moment, there's this revolutionary moment, because we know that Jesus doesn't remain dead. He raises from the dead, and so provides for us an inheritance. And instead of an inheritance that comes from this moment in Genesis chapter 3, where mistrust is sowed in the heart of humanity, instead of an inheritance that comes from a people who consistently walk in disloyalty, He provides something new. Which is why I loved that song that we sung and Adam's voice behind it. Make us new. Make us new. There's a section in the psalm, it's similar to that. And it says, where He shouts, you surround me with shouts of deliverance. This is that moment where His life-giving Spirit can now pour into our hearts and make us new. Where is your heart this morning? What does your life point to? Your life potentially will reveal where your heart is. What kind of heart did you bring in here with you this morning? What are you carrying? Are you doubting? Are you hurting? Are you mistrusting? Are you proud and hard-hearted? Are you fearful? Are you weary? Are you faithless? Whether for the first time or the 55th time, Jesus has peace and forgiveness and mercy and grace and comfort and healing that He wants to offer you. through his Spirit today. I was reading the Bible story last night with my little cousin, a 5-year-old, 4-year-old actually. We're reading through this passage in Genesis, and I was like, well, this is pretty epic. So it's in this rhyme, it's this little rhyme, and at the end it talks about how Jesus offers us forgiveness and love. You know, it like all crescendos at the end in this little ditty of a line and a rhyme, and I'm like, wow, these people are pretty proficient at writing this story in a way that is approachable for the littlest ones among us. And so I turned to him and I said to Adric, why? Why does Jesus love us and forgive us? And his answer was brilliant. That is what him does. I was like, right. That is what him does. Do you know that? Do you know that? Do you believe that this morning? That is what him does. And that's why we need these practices. Not so that we force his hand. Not so that we prove to him that though we know the things that are in our hearts or the actions that we've done that betray our hearts, that we prove or earn our way into his good graces. We do these practices because we need to be connected, and that's what these practices are intended to do. To relate us to him. And so the lectionary readings, they root us in this story. This story of grace, this story of newness, this story of redemption, this story of hope. And we listen to them over and over so that we can be rooted and grounded in the story. And we sit in silence and solitude so that the things that emerge out of us, we can find our way to them. What do I need? What am I longing for? What am I sorry for? And then we encounter Jesus and we don't receive condemnation because that's not who he is. That's not what him does. We receive mercy and we receive grace and forgiveness and newness of life and hope and healing. And we fast so that we move away from a distracted sense that we are independent and self-sufficient apart from God. We create in ourselves a sense of longing so that we know where sustenance comes from, where we receive true life. These practices keep us related. Because in Jesus you're offered mercy and belonging and love and grace. And it doesn't just end in what we receive. While being related is a huge part of Christ's work for us, it's only part of that. He gives us an identity, but then he gives us a renewed purpose, a vocation. That we would then be those people, having received those things, we then become those who offer those things into the worlds in which we live, in our families, in our jobs, in our neighborhoods, and in our communities. We become that redemptive presence of mercy and grace and peace and love and belonging and self-sacrificing love. We embody his presence into our communities. We receive the powerful presence of Jesus and then we offer him as an extension of who we are through the power of his Spirit. So in trusting dependence, we don't forget who we are. And we don't forget why we're here. The littlest foster kid that I hang out with, he was not feeling very well. And so we went to the hospital. I went with his mom, and we sat in the waiting room for a while and took his vitals and realized he was very ill. And so we went into a room and waited. And then he was so limp, usually he's like running around like a crazy fella. And he's laying there on his mom. She's holding him, and she's laying in this bed, and she's just holding him, foster mom. And he kind of opens his eyes and look over at me, and he's like, train. I'm like, oh yeah, you need your train. Totally what you need right now. So there's like a little car, there wasn't a train. I just handed it over to him. And then we waited there for a couple of hours, and then they came and said that they had a room in the ICU and we needed to be transported. And so she's his wires are all around her, and she like kind of holds him. He's 2, so he's not tiny, And they transfer her from one bed onto another bed, and she's laying there, and we're wheeled into the elevator, and we go upstairs, and it's in this hospital that is connected to a university. And usually in those moments, you don't just get a couple of people, you get like a whole entourage. So we're about to go into this room, and we have this entourage of people, and he kind of opens his eyes as she's about to lay him down, because the bed in the ICU is only big enough for his little body. And so she goes to lay him down, and he looks up, and he kind of looks around the room, and he sees all these people, and then he cries out. And so my friend, she just takes hold of him, and she stands there holding him, and she looks at him, and she's like, I won't let you go. I'm here with you. And so she stands there with him, holding him, and a half hour goes by, and you can see like the weight is heavy on her, but she will not let him go. It's this moment where this little boy's heart is being communicated to, that he is loved, that he is seen, that he belongs, and that she will not let him go. Even as she would kind of fumble a little bit, it's this self-giving act of love that she is offering to a child that is not her own. It's the redemptive presence of Jesus through her into that little boy's heart. It's what she's called to do. And it's a picture of what we're called to do. To embody that same self-giving love, which is a reflection of Jesus. A reflection of who he is and what he has done in the world and done in our own hearts, transforming us, making us new, making us people of mercy and of grace and of forgiveness and of self-giving love. We know who we are. We know what we're here to do. And we need Jesus' help. And he is here to help us. His presence in our midst, whether it's the first time today that you would trust his love for you, or whether you try to trust it every day. His Spirit is at work in you, creating newness in you. Your inheritance and your heritage and your genealogy is in him, your brother, who holds you and won't ever let you go. So that you will know your sense of belonging and your sense of purpose. We need to be related to him so that we're faithful. Because the world needs his presence, as that prayer today declared. And so as the worship team come up, I'd like there to be just a moment of quiet. A solitary, silent, not solitary, but this silent moment. We can just see what comes up in your own heart. Where do you need him to minister to you? Where do you need him to bring life, new life, refreshing life? This table here is set for you. As Jesus' body was broken, and as his blood was spilled, prior to that he sat at a table with his friends. And he said, "Do this in remembrance of me." And he held up the cup and he said, "There's a new thing that I'm doing. Do this in remembrance of me." Remember what I've done. Remember who I am. Stay connected to me so that you know who you are and what it is that you're here to do. Let's pray. Jesus, we need to be related to you, even in moments where we feel shame for the things that we've done, or we feel fearful of what might come, or we're struggling with doubt, or we don't know that our faith is going to hold us. Jesus, I thank you that you remain faithful, that you remain devoted not only to your Father but to us. And so would you instill in us a trust in that our hearts would not wander, that our lives would not reveal that we are wandering, but instead we would stay related to you. And in being related to you, we would receive mercy and grace and peace and hope. And because of that, we would be who you've called us to be. Your people that bring your kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. Pray these things in your name. Amen.